interdivisional competition under the lights here in Golden, Colorado.
This looks like as complete of a team as I've seen from Atlanta in the history of this franchise.
Everybody can be the guy.
Justin Burnett skies the empire.
Noah Coleman goes up above everyone.
Right to the summit goes Carl Enzo.
Jarvis rips it down.
Colorado, one big play after another.
Exactly the battle we wanted to see.
The heavyweight matchup, that's for sure.
Welcome back. It's Swing Pass. I'm Adam Ruffner. That is Cameron Brock. We've got a mega loaded 14-game Week 6 preview pod to get to. 10 teams will engage in doubleheaders. I don't have an official stat on that, but it's got to be a record for the UFA for most amount of doubleheader games. And boy, is the slate loaded. On Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, we'll feature potential playoff determining battles in each of the 4 divisions, with I feel like the headliner having to be the Super Series game on Friday night, a first ever meeting between Atlanta and Colorado, 2 teams currently sitting at 500 with championship aspirations, but one of them will plummet below the winning line after that matchup. Elsewhere, we have Carolina at Austin in a battle between the 2 previous South Division champions. That will be the game of the week featured on Watch UFA TV. Also, Boston engaging in one of the most hard-fought doubleheaders, although they'll have a day off in between New York and DC. Boston will be at New York on Friday night, get Saturday off, and then on Sunday host the 3-1 Breeze, the Glory, looking to really push themselves into dark horse championship contender territory, but they will need to pick up a first ever win against either New York or DC, 2 franchises that they have never won against. The Central, your division, Cam, will be complete chaos. You will be one of the teams engaged in a doubleheader this weekend alongside Madison and Chicago as well, both teams slated for doubleheaders. Madison will play at Chicago on Friday night and then host Detroit on Sunday. Chicago, again, will play on Friday and then face you guys on Saturday. And then Alley Cats will take a trip to Pittsburgh on Sunday. Again, just total schedule calamity heading into Week 6. There is also a Seattle SoCal doubleheader that we will touch on. But I want to bring you in at this point, Cam. There is so much to get to in this episode. Obviously, we're going to focus on the Super Series as well as the Game of the Week matchups. But where does your mind go as we kind of round out this first month of play and really get into, I feel like, the determining weeks of where we'll end up heading into the 2024 UFA playoffs?
So my eyes are drawn to Boston. They play New York and DC this weekend. They've already lost the matchup with both of those, so they're down 0-1 in the head-to-head with both DC and New York. It looks very likely that Boston, DC, and New York will be the 3 teams that are going to make the playoffs. And if DC can't pick off one or both of these teams, they might already be locking themselves into the 3 seed, which is not really a place you want to be, having to travel to potentially both New York and DC to make it to championship weekend. So we're going to know a lot about about Boston's playoff picture after this weekend, what their chances are of getting something other than that 3 seed. So both games were close. And actually, I think it was a 2-goal loss to New York and a 1-goal loss to DC. So they certainly have the capability to win. But there's probably going to be no kind of, I'll say, clearer with quotes there, playoff picture developing than the one in the East after this weekend.
You know, we talked at the end of the last episode about how this weekend could either make things a lot clearer for the playoff picture, or it could be an absolute monkey wrench chaos mode enabler where there's so many teams with 2 games that splits would really cause a lot of chaos. I feel like particularly when I look at the schedule skew in the Central, that's a mouthful right there. Madison at Chicago on Friday, that's a total toss-up. I feel like depending on that result and depending on how hard fought of a game it is, that will set up Saturday at Indianapolis a lot more than how we can determine right now. If Chicago somehow cruises to a relatively easy win, not something that often happens between the Union and Radicals, I'll just throw that out there. But if they somehow clear it and get some confidence and build off of last weekend's successes in Texas and head into Indy 4-1, they might feel like, I don't want to say that they could afford a loss, but it won't be as dire as if they drop that game to Madison. The Radicals improved to 3-1. Chicago drops to 3-2, and then they've got to face y'all and figure out a way to not plummet back to 500 after all of their successes against Houston and Austin. That is just kind of, again, the tip of the iceberg of this weekend. That doesn't even get to really the South, which again has Carolina, Austin, and Atlanta, the three prospective favorites for those three playoff seeds in that division, all facing very tough competition and all being in kind of toss-up matchups themselves. And then there's the East, where Philadelphia and Toronto are also active, but the eyes are all on the top of the division with Boston, New York, and DC facing each other.
It's kind of like you said, it could be complete chaos after this weekend. The Central Division, with all the possibilities of, like, you could have at the end of this weekend, there are 4 different potential teams that could be in first place in the Central Division. So, and it all just depends on how everything skews out. If we win both games, we would be in first. If Chicago wins both games, they'd be in first. If Madison wins both games, they would be in first. And if none of those teams win both of their games, Minnesota is going to be in first. So it is very wild in the Central as to like where this playoff picture is going to go. But I'm excited to see Carolina finally get back into a game. They've only played Atlanta so far. Colorado and Carolina and us here in Indy are the only teams in the league still with only 2 games played. So to be able to have all of us in action and get some more data on all of these teams, that'll be really nice so we can kind of see maybe where they stand. We feel, as we've said on this podcast, really good about Carolina potentially. If it wasn't for Salt Lake having already played 6 games and being 6-0, like Carolina is right up there in the argument for the team who looks the best in the league right now. And they've done it twice against Atlanta. If they're able to win against Austin this week and make that as convincing as their Atlanta wins, I might have to backtrack on my title favorites being the Shred, because while the Shred are 6-0, they have not had every game be to the caliber of the 3 games Carolina is going to have played at the end of this weekend.
You mentioned that the Central battle for first place is in total toss-up after this weekend's slate of results. That's true in basically 3 of the 4 divisions, other than the West, where your aforementioned Salt Lake are sitting at 6-0 with no real challenge to their first place position right now. In the South, East, and Central, there's all the possibility that we enter the weekend with a different team sitting in first place than we exit it. I mean, as improbable as it would be, if Boston does pick up wins against New York and DC, they would be sitting in first place, depending on point differential and all of that jazz. But again, they only lost to New York by 2 the other week and only lost to DC by 1. So this Boston team is nipping on their heels. We'll get to those East Division matchups in a moment. I wanted to really start on the Super Series game on Friday, free and live on YouTube, 9 p.m. Eastern. Just wanted to give a special note to that because they're moving it up 30 minutes in anticipation of some weather in the area. The Rockies, like most of the country right now, going through a little bit of a thunderstorm warning as we get into the summer months. I know in Madison this past weekend with Nationals and the Minnesota at Madison game, there's just been weather systems all over. So, it will affect this Super Series matchup. We will hopefully get in a full game, but this Atlanta at Colorado tilt is one of the more intriguing, I think, style matchups of first ever meetings that we've ever had in this league. It kind of reminds me a little bit of when we got the first DC versus Carolina matchup back in, I believe it was 2017 was the first time that they met. You might have to correct me. It might have been 2018. 2018 is the Nethercutt versus Rowan MVP versus MVP battle where both were just going head on head at each other. But this Atlanta, Colorado feels similar to me. There's just so many big names in this matchup. There's so much highlight potential. And there's two teams with losses that I think really affect their personal mojo, how they approach the game. And so having another loss of that caliber against either of these teams would be pretty detrimental for either team going forward. And I feel like Colorado is in more of a need win position, just given that they've had so few games so far. But Atlanta, if they drop this game after having won against New York in week 2 and ending their historic win streak, will be one of the bigger question marks I think I've ever had at this point in the season for any team ever. Like they obviously have the ability to go and knock down a true champion, and yet at the same time, they're sort of afflicted with the same disease that we've seen from this Hustle franchise a few times over the years, which is that they get a couple of the most quality wins in a season, and then they sort of can't take care of business when they need a win.
Yeah, we saw something similar in 2022, right? Where they missed the playoffs because of not being able to get like the consistent, like the wins where they needed to get them. I'm looking at their schedule right now because I was a little curious as to like, okay, what does a loss in this game really mean for Atlanta? Well, first off, it would drop them to 2-3. They have 2 more games against Carolina, who they've looked largely not in the same league with, who Carolina has really taken it to Atlanta both times. Granted, both those games were in Carolina, but
I was going to say they've reclaimed the big brother role that Carolina has
Yep.
I feel like, historically owned against Atlanta. The Hustle went 3-1 against the Flyers in 2023, but with Carolina winning their first 2 matchups in 2024, it's now even in their last 6 meetings.
Mhm.
So,
and here's the thing: they have 2 more Carolina matchups and 2 Austin Soul matchups, 1 home, 1 away. I mean, that's 5 games, including this weekend, that they, against very tough competition. I mean, is it crazy to say that like this almost feels like a must win because otherwise they might struggle to even get above 500 this year? I mean, it's pretty wild to say that, but they've had such a tough schedule. They have such a tough schedule. I mean, their schedule this year is absolutely loaded with playoff team after playoff team and teams that we consider to be some of the top in the league, and they need to find a way to win some of these big matchups. I do feel good about them coming into this matchup. I think they have pretty much their entire roster, their top 20 that they would want going to this game, which is something they didn't have in either of their Carolina matchups, and I do think that will make a large difference for them being able to just travel with their top 20. And on the other hand, Colorado looks to still be down Quinn Finer, who's yet to make an appearance in this season. And you can make an argument as the most important player on that Colorado Summit roster. So this might be a situation where maybe they can take advantage of that, actually being at full strength and taking on a team that might be down, 1 or 2 guys that could be important to their side. So
I want to continue on this kind of intangibles discussion before we get more into a stylistic breakdown of what it means when the Hustle meet the Summit. But to your point about Finer, I've heard some rumblings that he's been dealing with a hamstring issue, which, if you're familiar at all, is just one of the most nagging and pernicious injuries that can beset an elite player. It feels like you can do everything in preparation to rehab it, and be prepared to go out, and then it will tighten up during warm-ups or just betray you at the worst possible moments. I know here in Madison, that was sort of the ending legacy of Kevin Brown. I think basically every franchise has a story of somebody afflicted with hamstring woes, and so it's just unfortunate that a 2-time All-UFA member and the 2022 Rookie of the Year runner-up is just unable to make his 2024 debut yet. Also on the other side for Atlanta, they will be down, still inactive, hasn't made his season debut yet. The 2024 Callahan winner, Aiden Downey, just nominated this past week at College Nationals. Big hats off to him. So now Atlanta rosters the last 2 Callahan winners on their team, the 2023 winner Justin Burnett, an All-UFA defensive member, as well as now Aiden Downey, who is still waiting to make, I feel like, his true pronounced impact at the professional level. But I wanted to touch on, you mentioned the Hustle's upcoming schedule. I feel like Colorado could really add to that too, because after they host Atlanta this weekend, they will then have to go on the road to face the Spiders, a team in which they lost at Oakland last year, very famously in Week 8, dropping their game at Salt Lake and then turning around and having just an absolute highlight-packed jam fest in Oakland the following day, but losing to the upstart Spiders in the middle of the 2023 season. Then they have to go at Salt Lake. Then they have to go at Madison and at Minnesota. This is all before June 15th for the Summit, mind you. Then they have to face at home a San Diego team that looks very disciplined and able to take down a top team should they not bring their A game. And then they've got to go on the road to face Seattle, which is currently polling like the number 3 team in that division as far as talent and looks, and could be a real feisty matchup in Seattle. That has been a Cascades team that even in their down years can take down some pretty good teams in Memorial Stadium. I'm thinking back to 2021 when they took down Dallas. You know, Dallas was a playoff team that year. They entered the season at the top of my power rankings. I completely forgot about that. But then, you know, Colorado, to round out their schedule, they go at Portland, and then they host you guys, which is not going to be a gimme for them. And then they host LA, a team that, again, won at Colorado the last time they played there. And so I totally hear you as far as Atlanta needing this win, given their slate coming up in the South. But it could be argued that the Colorado Summit need this just as much, if not more, especially given the just total melee of the West. I mean, you know, I know that they're still kind of looking to establish a true winning pattern, but Portland isn't necessarily as easy as an out as I think many people think of them as coming into 2024. Head coach Timmy Purston has them playing a little bit more system approach on offense. David Barram and Felix Morin and some of their playmakers can really score against any kind of defense. They're still a little atomized in their production. You know, it's kind of 1 to 3 different players going off in any given game and then sort of amassing production elsewhere. But Portland isn't a gimme. I don't know, man. Like, this is going to be such a tipping point, I feel like, for both Atlanta and Colorado. Neither of them can really afford to lose this matchup.
Yeah, and I might even be a little bit more worried about Colorado, given that Quinn Finer still hasn't been on the field. I don't think I realized exactly how important he is to this team until the Salt Lake game. And it looked in that Salt Lake game like Alex Atkins is another guy, right, that we talked about being a potential like MVP candidate with what he can bring to the table. But I think where Quinn Finer kind of sets himself apart from his teammate is the level-headedness he plays with, where I felt like we saw in that Salt Lake game kind of a complete emotional breakdown, like almost team-wide from Colorado. It was like once it went bad, you just saw it in the body language of so many players. And probably most pronounced was the way we saw it in Alex Atkins, who, you know, had probably one of his roughest nights he's had as a UFA pro, right? And I think Quinn Finer is such a stabilizing presence for them, not just from his production on the field and what he can offer with both his throws and his cutting, but just his level-headedness that he brings to that team. Like, they have a lot of young, very athletic players who you see it. They get fired up when they make a play, but it really seemed in that Salt Lake game to kind of swing the other direction, where when plays were being made against them, you saw heads hanging. You saw people they looked tired despite being the team who was hosting the game and who hadn't played a game the day before. And that's what that emotional like highs and lows can do to you. It can make you feel exhausted when you really shouldn't be. And I feel like that's what we saw. They need Quinn Finer back, I think, in the worst way. I am very nervous for them going to this game because I feel like the same thing could happen if we see, Brett Holzmeyer popping off in the second quarter with a couple big scores, and we start to see those heads hanging. Like, to me, the game's over at that point. So Colorado needs to find a way to win those moments happen, and they will. Atlanta's a good team. They're going to punch Colorado in the face at points during this game. Colorado needs to be able to find it in themselves to punch back and to not have this team-wide emotional letdown. I think having Nethercutt back will help. He's played so many big games and been in so many big situations, and just has that. I think he'll bring a veteran presence that can really help there. He wasn't active for the Salt Lake game, so having him back, I think, will help in that regard. But I think the difference in this game is going to be the fact that Atlanta is basically at full strength and Colorado's down arguably their most important player.
I mean, point blank period, in the past 5 to 8 years, Quinn Finer is one of the most efficient and productive scorers this league has seen. I mean, I put him in the same category as like a Ryan Osgar and right now Jordan Kerr. I would probably stretch that list a little bit if I had to think about it just a little bit longer. Again, like Jack Williams comes to mind. I'm sure I'm blanking on one other player that sort of just fills it up without really taking off the plate. Brett Holzmeyer is actually really getting to that level right now. He's completing near 97% of his throws and racking up nearly 500 yards of total offense while contributing 6 scores a game. I mean, that's the kind of level of production Finer has had through his first 2 seasons in this league. Where my mind goes to is that Atlanta, much like Colorado, was lacking a couple of their most instrumental pieces when they won at Indy against you guys. Colorado returns Nethercutt, but Atlanta will also be returning Christian Olsen and Matt Smith, 2 of their biggest offensive operators and 2 of the most established veterans in this league. And it got me thinking that we talk so much about how much they contribute to this hustle offensive system and how much the Atlanta team can benefit from more possession-based, settle-down drives when it's Olsen kind of operating as this cleaner fish in tight spaces and Smith just being able to get separation at will and seemingly not make mistakes. But what we don't talk about what that does is that it sets the table for that deep look game that is the true explosiveness for this Atlanta team, which is run by Austin Taylor and Bobby Lay. And those 2 now get to throw at elevation. And we talk about it, I feel like, at the edges, but there is this element of there's a new disc that drives further, and the 2 best hucking teammates from last season now get to test their range in the Rockies. And I feel like for as good and stout as Colorado's defense can be, they do need to be careful for not allowing this Atlanta balanced attack to just start picking their shots deep. Because again, in the first 3 seasons of hucking stats being kept in this league, the Atlanta team was head and shoulders above the competition as far as huck success rate. They were completing above 70% as a team. And so when you get that kind of talent, you get that kind of balance in these kind of environments, I do think the Summit have to be careful about not allowing Atlanta to just pop off.
I agree. I think we've seen kind of the blueprint for this. Like Carolina did this really well, where they kind of just disconnected the backfield from everything else, and they really made it hard for them to catch in that mid space. And Atlanta is just so much more of an average hucking team when they're not setting it up off of like motion off of an in cut and then getting the disc back to Bobby Lay or Austin Taylor. We even saw it in the Indy playing indoors, where a couple of times they took some crossfield huck attempts that just were off the mark because they weren't trying to hit those hucks off of motion. They were trying to hit them off of a standstill. And that is like where Atlanta can get themselves into trouble sometimes, is going for those shots out of, on like a stall 4 or 5 where it hasn't been out of motion. So if Atlanta can avoid making those mistakes, which they largely did in the New York game, like if you want to go see an example of when they really kind of picked their shots and waited until they moved the disc a little bit before they shot it. I think the New York game is a pretty good example of that. Because on the flip side, the Hustle have the second worst defense on a turn. They're allowing their opponents to convert at almost 62% on break chances. Granted, two of those games have been against Carolina, but we saw some success even in Indy. And with New York, they just really didn't give them a lot of chances. So, they they only had one break in that game, but they barely had the disc defensively at all. And I think what we have seen some in the games where the Hustle have struggled is that they're turning the disc over early and having to spend more time with their offense on the field. And when their offense gets tired, they make tired throwing decisions, which just leads to more defense and more exhaustion, which leads to more bad decisions later. It becomes this vicious cycle. If Atlanta can stay out of that early and make sure that they're taking shots out of motion, it could be a really long night for the Summit because, like you said, they have been the best hucking team in the league since that stat has started being tracked. And it's been because of the consistency with which Austin Taylor and Bobby Lake can hit people in stride out in front instead of what we see from a lot of teams when they throw deep, which is, discs that sometimes become more 50-50s. They don't throw a lot of 50-50s. And let's be real, when they're throwing to Holzmeier, even if there's a defender near, that doesn't feel like a 50-50. That feels like a 90-10, as there just aren't a lot of people who are going to match up well with him. And even though Colorado's got some bigger defenders that I think certainly are capable of matching him, maybe stride for stride and maybe in height, Brett Holzmeier is so good about positioning and boxing out in a way so that even if you do have the athletic ability to match up with him, he's going to put you in a box to where he's going to be the only one with a play on the disc. So I don't know. I think that's kind of like the matchup I'm looking for is like when Atlanta does turn the disc, can they get it back? Because they haven't been great at getting it back this year when they've turned it. And if Colorado is going to find some success in this game, they're going to have to convert probably around that 60% on their break opportunities and not really let a lot of those slip through their fingers.
I wanted to make a couple of final points, and then we've just got so much more bulk to get to that we've got to move on from this particular matchup, although I feel like I could spend another hour talking about Atlanta at Colorado. To your point about Holzmeier, I think with the downturn of Ben Yot and with Jeff Babbitt kind of subverting his big man role that he has historically taken in his first year with Boston, Brett Holzmeier right now is the best big in the league. Like his ability to work into handler sets, become a high volume thrower, work into small spaces, participate in the small ball movement that generates so much of Atlanta's offensive attack, and then his ability to still go downfield and be the big guy the size of a refrigerator and just that tough to get around. I don't think that there is that balanced of a big elsewhere right now. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I don't even think there's like an argument. I think he's in a league of his own right now when it comes to that, for sure.
Yeah, and I think that it's something that, for your point of Colorado having some size, they could be in a little bit of trouble of there's levels to this. Like, yeah, you have size. Is it the size that can specifically match Holzmeier, or are you simply putting a tall person one-on-one versus the best big in the league right now, which is how you get a little bit taken advantage of. Now, I thought it was interesting in the first game against Carolina, Holzmeier didn't play in the second matchup, but in the first meeting, he had an absolutely fantastic matchup, terrific box score stat, but he kind of filled it all up in a silo because Carolina sort of attacked the other portions of Atlanta's offense and limited those and contained those areas. I'm wondering if the Summit do a little bit of that in this game and allow Holzmeier to get his and maybe focus a little bit more, so to speak, down rotation on the Christian Olsen, on the Jeremy Langdon, which has been such an X factor for the Hustle. You know, he didn't have a turnover in that win against New York and scored a couple of times in the clutch. And it's just, as I talked about in the previous episode, one of those players that I feel like people continually forget the kind of level he can really elevate to in big games. I wanted to also touch on we're very likely to get a Justin Burnett versus Noah Kuhlman matchup, which might result in the highest double bid layout ever. I really feel like we could get like two players jumping over the head of a third player sort of play, where it's just both of them breaking conventions of gravity and human flight a little bit. Like that's going to be one to watch. I'm also just really excited, I feel like, for how these teams respond. You talk about Colorado's emotionality. I feel like this Atlanta team still has a lot of emotion to it. And I feel like that's been especially apparent in the New York win and the two Carolina losses, where maybe they weren't necessarily, emoting to show their frustration against being defeated by the Flyers, but there was a visible sort of body language to the acceptance of, oh crap, Carolina's back after we sort of had their number last year. And I'm just, again, in a broadly fan spectator way, interested to see how each team takes the first haymaker that the other one throws, because you mentioned it a little bit earlier in the segment. Like, both these teams are going to land their shots. Like, both these teams like to make highlights. Both these teams like to let you know that they're here tonight. And so I want to see which of them can sort of accept one of those blows and then respond to it. I feel like heading into it, I have more faith in Atlanta, but Colorado's going to be playing at home. They're going to be playing with their backs against the wall. And I still have a lot of faith in the talent of this Colorado team to get it done, maybe even without Feiner.
I don't, but that's why we play the game, right? Because, we've already seen matchups this year that have gone in different ways than we thought. I mean, just look to last week where the Austin and Chicago matchup, where if you would have told me Austin was only going to score 13 goals in that game, I would have told you were absolutely nuts. And yet here we are, right? So it's going to be a fun one. I mean, it's hard to say that I'm starring this one on the calendar for this week with so many great games to watch. But seeing as I will be playing myself on Saturday and Sunday, the Friday games are really going to have my attention. And I mean, it's going to be hard. This is where I'm really glad that we're in different time zones for some of our games on Friday night, because I can, watch the Boston New York game and then flip over to the Atlanta Colorado game later, with that later start time out in the mountain time zone. So it'll be good.
Well, let's not leapfrog too quickly, because there's still the game of the week matchup in the South. True. With 2-0 Carolina going to face 2-1 Austin. I wanted to get to that one next. Carolina will be without three pretty notable starters in Saul Yannick, Henry Fisher, and Dylan Hawkins, while Austin looks completely full strength. They had Matt Armour and Elliott Moore off of their D-line last weekend, and that was pretty crucial in a one-goal loss where they could just get no purchase on either line as far as conversions or any sense of real team identity. And this is an Austin team that has shown that for as much as you might want to sandbag them heading into this matchup, given how they looked against Chicago last weekend and given how Carolina has looked so good in 2 wins against Atlanta, this is the exact position where the Soul kind of turn into Wolverines and could come out with something like a 4-goal win over a Flyers team who is still very, very strong in this matchup. Will be returning Alan Laviolette, who is not active in the team's second win, and features, I feel like, again, one of the MVP favorites in this early season portion in Anders Jungs, and just has, talent on talent on talent on all of their lines.
Yep, Flyers down a couple. No Saul Yannick, no Henry Fisher, but they're just such a deep team that it almost feels like they can go into every matchup down a couple of guys. It's like, oh, it's okay. We just replace them with these other fantastic players. Look, Austin, you're talking about emotional teams. Austin is as emotional of a team as you're going to find in the league. They get fired up over every single thing that they do. And last week, they did get punched in the face. I mean, I really think they took Chicago lightly going into that game and just weren't prepared for what Chicago threw at them. But like you said, with this Austin Soul team, you almost can't even carry over any result from week to week, because they certainly have the capability to punch up to pretty much anyone. And we just see from time to time that they punch down. I was lauding them their first couple weeks for not punching down to Dallas and Houston. And then it looked like they completely took their eyes off the ball and looked past Chicago, and they paid for it. We know they're not looking past Carolina. This is a game that they probably have starred on their calendar all year as one where they're excited to go and try to prove how good of a team they are. They're hosting this game as well. I just in talking with some people affiliated with Austin Soul, I know they're really excited about their home stadium and making that kind of their home stadium for the year and the atmosphere they're able to generate there. Even heard
they just lost their home opener to an interdivisional opponent that they were not anticipating coming in and winning that game. I'm just saying, like, I get
that, but I think this is different. Austin Soul, you always have to look at in a vacuum. Like we've learned this, right? Like look at last year where they couldn't beat Atlanta. Excuse me, they couldn't beat Atlanta or Carolina during the regular season, and they just went and beat them both in the playoffs, right? Like you got to look at a vacuum with them, and I would not say that with most teams, but I feel like they have proven over the course of the last few years that like one result does not necessarily indicate anything about their next result. It just seems all so disconnected.
Yeah, I just feel like that. I feel like they took advantage of, again, a down year Carolina team last year. That was a different formation of what we're used to seeing from Triangle Ultimate.
For sure.
To be frank. This is a franchise. This is a pipeline. And last year, for whatever reason, through whatever smattering of injuries, unavailabilities, lack of performance in the early part of the year, that by the time they got to that playoff game in Austin, they were kind of trending downward while the Soul were absolutely surging and able to kind of just ride that white hot heat wave that carried them into their first championship weekend appearance. Right now, in this matchup, I'm worried for the Soul. To your point of they probably prepped coming into the season of this matchup, that I feel like cuts the bad way for them, given how tight they looked against Chicago. I mean, they were in their heads last week. And given that Carolina is coming off of two big brother wins against the reigning regular season division champions from last year in Atlanta, I don't know, man. Like, this is the kind of exact emotionality that a Flyers organization prides itself on taking advantage of. When you talk about the volatility of the Soul, Carolina has kind of the opposite approach. They will just run their lines at you and let you punch yourself out of existence. And given what we saw from the Soul last week, I mean, again, they only took 7 huck looks in that game. They completed 3 of them for 43% or 43%. They were 10 of 16 in the red zone for just 63%. I totally hear you on you can't take singular results from this Austin team seriously, but those are distressing numbers for a team that prides itself on red zone conversion rate and sort of taking aggressive looks that it knows it can complete in one-on-one scenarios. Like, they didn't have either of that last week against a Chicago team that they would have favored themselves heavily against.
Well, they're just lucky that I don't think Carolina is going to double team every single time Austin has the disc, because that's not what Carolina does. But if I were Carolina, that's what I'd be doing, because Austin looked like they didn't know that double teaming was allowed.
I mean, it
was pretty embarrassing.
They had one look off of the sideline last weekend, and that was trying to do a very advantageous 40-yard cross-field backwards dump. And a few times it resulted in them just yielding the disc like 5 yards outside of the end zone.
Yeah, the first play I saw when I tuned into the game was them being double teamed on the sideline, and I don't remember who picked up the disc, but they threw a crossfield hammer that essentially landed out on the front cone for Chicago to pick up. Like, I was just like, yeah, have you ever seen a double team before? Like, the funny thing is, like, I remember a couple years ago, they were a team that I thought was probably utilizing first, like, in terms of utilizing it the most, the roller pole, and like doing that so often, you would think a team that does that would be better prepared to actually complete the first pass when they're having a roller pull against them, but they look completely unprepared. Several times they were double teamed in the backfield, and they ran a one-person backfield with 6 people upfield when the disc is being double teamed. It's like they made everything so hard on themselves. And I mean, if I was Carolina, I would just come into this game and just double team, because Austin looked like they just had no clue what to do when that was happening. That being said, I don't think Carolina's going to do that. It's not necessarily something we've seen from them in the past where they just do a lot of heavy double teaming. We see that in the Central a lot between Madison and Minnesota and Chicago. So, and even us from time to time, although we probably do it the 4th most out of our division compared to those other teams. And so we're used to it, but I think Carolina down a couple of pieces. Granted, I mentioned their depth and how it almost seems like they can do that and just be completely fine. I think Austin, I think this is a get-right game for Austin. I still favor Carolina. I think you're right. I think Carolina is going to be the big brother to everyone in that division this year. It would not shock me if we're looking at a Carolina team that locks up the 1 seed by their 9th game of the season, because I think they just look that good, and given their schedule and who they play and when they play them, I think that's a totally feasible result for them. But like I said, like this Austin team, it's so hard to look at them week to week, and like I almost feel like as bad as they looked in that Chicago game, I almost feel like I can look past it and be like, yeah, that they were bad, but I don't think that tells me who they are this week or who they can be. I think they're just one of those teams that they have the high ceiling and they have the low floor, and we saw the floor last week. I don't think we're going to see it back-to-back weeks.
I'll say one more thing I'm a little concerned about in this particular matchup for Austin: their offensive height versus Carolina's defensive height. Like, I think that Carolina's defense has a size advantage that could play out pretty significantly if we get another windy game. And I think that's kind of what Chicago had at times against Austin. They just had a little bit of size and could kind of shoulder into places that they need to get to in another otherwise very let's call it hard fought game where the wind just made everything so difficult that something like being able to body out, being able to shield and get the disc in a space you need becomes very important. And I don't know, it's one of the things I've generally been curious about with it. The Austin offense in general, they have so much playmaking and they have so much big throwing that I think they sort of mask that they don't really have a big body, a big target that can just go get them buckets in the same way that a lot of their peers do at the championship contender level.
Yeah, I mean, it was a little shocking that they tried to, not that they tried it a ton. I mean, I think what you said, they had only 7 huck attempts, which isn't like an astronomical number by any means. But without the height, it's like sometimes a couple of those throws, they look like jump balls, and it's like, jump balls to who? Like who on your roster down there is going to come down with it over 2 or 3 defenders? I mean, there aren't a lot of guys on that line, as you mentioned. I think they really just have to rely on offensively. They have to just string together passes. Like, they can't be relying on the deep ball. And if they're going to take those away shots, they need to be hitting people in stride. They can't throw these moon balls, which in the wind we saw last week, every shot deep kind of turned into some sort of 50-50. And they're not going to win those, not against this Carolina team with the height that they have. But I do think, excuse me, I do think they have the ability to win in some small spaces. Like, Evan Swiatek is as good as there is in the league at winning his matchup and just being available and being open somewhere. You obviously have Kyle Hinkie, who's been just a playmaker for, gosh, what's it been, like 6 years now? Man. And, you know, they've developed some other players as well. The younger, you know, Mark Hinkie, like younger Hinkie brother sometimes goes out there and puts on a show. I don't expect Mark Evans to have as bad of a week this week. 7 throwaways last week. I know he's got to be thinking about that all week. I think there's just I just don't see it playing out the same way. I don't see Najee letting his team go out and play the same way. I think there's going to be a lot of stylistic like adaptations and just making sure they kind of stick to what they're good at. And last week they didn't really do that.
Yeah, I mean, I hear all that. It's just that the opponent that they're up against can kind of anticipate a lot of those adjustments. I mean, if it weren't for Bryce Merrill and Salt Lake 6-0 run and kind of all the adjustments that they've been making, I mean, Denardis looks ripe for a Coach of the Year repeat in his own right. Like the way in which Carolina has approached the beginning part of their schedule has been impressive as any team in this league. But once again, I'm going to make us plow forward because we've touched on 2 of 14 games and we've just got to get to the rest of the slate in some capacity. So, Cam, I propose that now we engage in a little bit of a segment I would like to call What Could Go Right and What Could Go Wrong for the rest of the matchups. Well, not all of the matchups, but ones that we want to highlight, starting in the East Division on Friday night with Boston at New York. 3-2 Boston visiting the 4-1 reigning champion Empire, who have now constructed 3 straight wins since dropping their Week 2 matchup in Atlanta. Cameron, with Boston kind of being the prospective underdogs in this matchup, having never won against the Empire, what could go right for Boston and what could go wrong for their meeting in New York on Friday?
Yeah. So what could go right for Boston? Well, what could go right is the fact that they have Orion Cable in this game, and that he is able to unlock a little bit of their offensive struggles. They haven't been terrible offensively, but they have looked very stilted in their attack from time to time. And adding a player with his size and skill, putting him alongside Carapella, Chan, and Babbitt, I think that's just honestly just like a lethal cutting core. All of them being able to play off of each other. We've only seen Orion Cable in one game this year, I believe. I think it was the Toronto game, a game that Boston was heavily favored in, would have won without Orion Cable, but I think having all of those horses available and in the stable this week, like I think that is going to be the difference. Now, what can go wrong for Boston? Well, the Empire offense, the version of it we're seeing now, was essentially debuted in that first Boston matchup. And it looked good. It looked much improved from the Atlanta game where New York looked just hapless on offense at times. And in that game, it looked good. And the thing is, it's only gotten better since then. They had their best performance of the season, granted against a Philadelphia team that has statistically been at or near the bottom in pretty much every defensive category. But even going into that Montreal game and the second day of that doubleheader looked much improved. I think this Empire offense is finding its rhythm. It's not the explosive offense that we saw in previous seasons with Ryan Osgar and John Lithgow over there and Jeff Babbitt. But it is a stable offense. It looks like it's moving the disc much better. So what can go right? Boston's offense looks great with Orion Cable there. What can go wrong is that they're catching the Empire at a time where they're really finding their stride, and their offense just isn't going to give them as many opportunities as they did in their last matchup.
It's not as sexy as we're used to seeing from the Empire offense when they were just the full high-octane highlight show winning 31 straight games. But, man, it's so effective. I mean, we touched on it a little bit in the recap episode on Tuesday, but this Empire throwing unit with Elliot Chartok and Solomon Rushmeyer Bailey and Jack Williams and Charles Weinberg, like they're as versatile and effective as any throwing lineup in the league. Like there's just not much you can do to pressure them out of getting to their spots. And while they do lack a little bit of the deep dimension of what Lithgow and Osgar provided for them, they still can engage in that, as you saw this past week. I think especially from Charles Weinberg, who just sort of exploded in that continuation throwing role. I mean, he's really got a range that I feel like many opponents underrate, especially if you just give him clear vision to look downfield. But the same thing goes for Elliot Chartok. I mean, without Ben Yacht being at his absolute optimal performance, it limits a little bit of his abilities, but he's still one of the best full range throwers from both backhand and forehand sides. And if you get him on a rail, he can just absolutely extend the vertical dimension of your offensive attack. And again, it's not the same effect. It's not the light and gun show of Osgar just airing stuff out to Babbitt going up into the stratosphere and pulling down, but they're able to construct a kind of attack that continues to put defenses on their heels. And I wanted to then flip it to the other side, New York's defense. It feels like that was actually a little bit of the slow roller at the start of this season. And I felt like against Philly, which is, again, a team a little bit in disarray right now, they sort of reasserted themselves on the fact of just being able to engage their counter so quickly. What I was really dismayed about the Empire coming into 2024 was how slow they were in their transition attack, which was what was so crucial to them being the dominant performers that they were in their 2 straight championship wins. You know, they're a team that just pounces on you once they get that turnover. They're not necessarily getting a whole bunch of layout blocks a la Salt Lake or something, but when they do get a takeaway, they look to convert that in like 3 to 5 throws. They remind me a lot of Minnesota in that capacity, where they're effectively blitzing you on the counter. If you're not picking up numbers, if you're not identifying who's sort of running at you downfield, they'll just throw to open space and find an easy break. And I felt like that's what I saw against Philadelphia, where it was just them getting a pressure turnover from the Phoenix offense and then converting within, what felt like 10 to 15 seconds. And if Boston can't prevent that from happening, I'm worried about them in this matchup.
Yeah. We'll see. I mean, it's an exciting matchup. I was looking at the schedule for Friday and I realized we're going to have Boston, New York at 7 Eastern and Central Time, we're going to have Madison, Chicago, and Carolina and Austin at 7 Central. And then we're going to have Atlanta, Colorado at 7 Mountain Time. So every hour.
Friday will be the most jam-packed night of Ultimate that we've had so far this season. I mean, it will just be like 5 to 6 straight hours of playoff level competition. And that'll get me into the next matchup that I wanted to touch on as far as what could go right, what could go wrong, particularly for Madison heading to 3-1 Chicago. Madison sitting again at 2-1 and coming off of a pretty substantial loss to Minnesota at home. They now are just 3-9 at Breeze Stevens in their last 12 games there. Pretty precipitous fall off for a team that didn't lose a divisional game there from 2013 through 2018 at some point, or actually 2019, because the losses that they sustained in 2017 and 18 were to out of division opponents in Dallas and Carolina. But Madison coming off of a loss, Chicago coming off of 2 big road wins. What could go right and what could go wrong for the Radicals in this matchup?
So what could go right is, despite maybe not having a guy like KPS, losing a guy like Jacob Reuben-Miller, what can go right is that Madison still finds a way to muck up offenses and create break opportunities. So what can go right for them is that they do generate a lot of break opportunities. I think, Chicago came out with a couple of wins, but they also had a lot of turnovers on the weekend. Their offense has not necessarily looked the cleanest this year. And I think Chicago is probably going to give them some opportunities. And I also think Madison has the ability to generate some opportunities where they can get some break chances. I mean, they converted their breaks against Minnesota at a 60% rate. I mean, that's kind of what you want. They were 6 for 10 on break opportunities. You convert 6 breaks in a game, like, you feel pretty good about yourselves. But the problem was on the other side, they gave up 60% and gave up 15 opportunities. So that leads me to what can go bad is that Madison tries to huck their way into a win. Madison has Kai Marcus back. He clearly makes them a better team throwing deep, but they can't just rely on that over and over and over again. They just don't have the horses to throw to down there either. They don't have a lineup that makes you think you want to be throwing it, deep 15, 16 times. They converted on 63% of their hucks, which isn't a terrible number, but when your volume is at 16 and you're throwing 6 turnovers, that's just not going to cut it. So I would love to see that huck number down closer to 10. I think that's a little bit more appropriate given the lineup that they're throwing out there. They could get themselves into real trouble if they try to huck themselves to victory.
Well, and I kind of wanted to talk about it from this angle. Is their new quick attack offense really what suits and complements their defense that is currently 5th in defensive conversion rate and 1st in breaks per game? Again, that's largely due to facing Pittsburgh and Detroit offenses, 2 of the more substandard units in the league right now. But they're converting above 11 breaks a game through 3 games this season. Again, they're 5th in efficiency. To your point, the sort of huck-happy Radicals offense that is making them a little bit more, I feel like the word is dangerous in a certain capacity. They can attack vertically a little bit better than they have in the past. This is a Radicals team that has historically struggled to establish their hucking game. So I feel them in that capacity to develop that, yet they're sort of giving quick turnovers to the opponents and then having to run back out this defense that is efficient, but isn't maybe as stout as it has been in previous seasons. And it's just, again, a Madison team that I feel like thrives in the margins, and they're a team that can win a lot of close games, but when they're just sort of opening stuff up and hoping to win in a shootout, that's relatively new territory where I don't feel like their identity has really persisted into.
I'd agree with all that.
But we should keep moving on. We've covered the 4 Friday matchups. On Saturday, you guys get back into action. You host Chicago. So we kind of asked it on the Madison side, but I'll ask it in the Indy side. What can go right for the Alley Cats and what can go wrong for you guys in this matchup, being in your first game of the weekend facing a Chicago team coming off of what figures to be a pretty tough matchup against Madison?
What can go right for us is that we handle their constant roller pulls and double teaming without it really affecting us. This is a little bit anecdotal because we don't really have a stat for this, but I feel like we're a team that generally handles double teams pretty well. We're very used. We get a lot of reps of teams doing the roller pulls on the sidelines between them and Madison and Minnesota. So we're very practiced in it. And in an indoor environment where you're not going to have that 8th defender of the wind, I feel like if they try to rely too heavily on that, that might be something, we can take advantage of, or something that we can just execute well out of, because we saw a majority of the turnovers they forced against Austin in that game were due to roller pulls and double teaming and the problems it was causing Austin. So if we're going to be successful, that's what's going to go right for us, is that we're not going to lose to the double teaming and the roller pulls. What can go wrong for us would be our offense turning the disc over near our defending end zone. When you look at the points in the Atlanta game where we struggled offensively, it was when we struggled to get early movement in our offense. On the points where we got moving and kind of got down the field within a few throws and were able to work it to midfield, we were very successful. I think we actually were almost perfect in the red zone against Atlanta. I think our one imperfection was actually a first throw turn from our D line, if I remember correctly, I think we're 13 for 14. So when we get the disc moving, we're very lethal, but we've had issues early this season with getting it moving early in the point. So if it goes wrong for us, that's where it's going to go wrong. We're going to have early turnovers that are going to result in Chicago's D line having a short field to work with.
Yeah, and I also feel like you guys could maybe struggle a little bit from just having a few games or weeks off now from your last matchup with Atlanta, coming off of a loss versus a Chicago team that could be surging off of three straight wins should they win against Madison at home on Friday. And even though they might be playing with a little bit of tired legs, we saw last weekend that did not affect a Union team down in Texas Heat against a reigning divisional champion. And so I worry a little bit too that if you guys just get caught flat-footed a bit, this Chicago team could kind of be running down off the mountain at you guys.
Yeah, we'll have to really. I mean, it's hard to because we have a doubleheader that we're gearing up for as well. We have to make sure we really take care of business here. As I mentioned at the top of the show, like we have an opportunity here too to come out of this weekend being in first place in the division. But that only happens if we take care of business, and it's going to start at that Chicago game. Chicago has, shown that they're a resilient team, that they can win ugly games like they did in that Austin game. And we have to be prepared for them to make this game ugly. We know they're probably not going to put up a lot of scores just based off of what we've seen over the last season and a half from them, but they haven't always needed to because they've been so effective in limiting the scoring of the other team. So I'm looking forward to it. Like you said, we've only had 2 games. I've just been itching to get out on the field. Like I see all these teams that already at 4, 5, 6 games played, and we're just sitting over here twiddling our thumbs, just like waiting for our opportunities. So excited for the matchup. I know they're going to be tough. The Chicago Indy rivalry, runs through all sports. So we're always excited to play them, and we always know it's going to be a good matchup.
Of note, Chicago will be down their captain, Jack Shanahan, this weekend. He is not listed as active in either the Madison or Indianapolis matchups, and he was so crucial for their wins in both Houston and Austin, completing some absolutely dynamite hucks downfield. Again, he's 9 of 10 through the team's first set of games this season and is just in that facilitator role that I think makes him such an important weapon for Chicago. But he will not be active, so maybe a place where you guys can take advantage of. We've got to keep moving on, and I wanted to bundle this next team for you. Seattle, 3-2, going down to face, I think, an underratedly tough SoCal road trip starting on Saturday in San Diego against the 2-3 Growlers, who just continue to battle as the toughest competition against the current first place team in the West Division, Salt Lake, but could not pick up a win last weekend in Salt Lake. But just, they look tough, man. Like Travis Dunn is playing out of his mind, as he pretty much does every single year. And there's just a discipline and a depth to the Growlers on both sides of the disc that makes them a tough out over 4 quarters. And so against a Seattle team that looks like the third most talented team in the West Division, but is still looking to establish itself as a winning franchise, that's going to be a really tough matchup. And then they've got to go for their second game of the weekend to LA on Sunday and face a 1-2 Aviators team who we kind of referenced and haven't really talked much about this season yet because, they haven't played 2 games like you, Carolina, and Colorado, but they've only played 3, and we just don't know much about the Aviators at this point. And so Seattle versus Aviators on Sunday will be a really important tilt. LA swept the season series in 2023, but the Cascades are going to be bringing a damn near full roster. They will be down Tommy Lee, Cedar Hines, and Shane Worthington, all very notable starters for them so far this season. LA will be down KJ Koo, as well as, and we, I think, mentioned on this show, Brandon Van Duzen, one of the league leaders in completions and passing last year. He will be out for the rest of the season with a back injury, a really notable loss for a playoff team from last year in LA. But I wanted to propose to you what can go right, what could go wrong for the Seattle team that is, again, sort of holding the inside position right now on third place in the West Division. They are in a tie with Oakland, having literally split both of their games with the Spiders by a single goal apiece. I would have to look into the deeper tiebreaker analytics to see which 3-2 team actually holds the advantage currently. But to speak more broadly, Seattle is again at 3-2, and they can't really afford to drop either of these games in Southern California.
No, I'm going to kind of bundle these games, and, what can go wrong is that they look past Seattle and they're looking to LA. And I say look past San Diego.
San Diego.
Sorry, San Diego.
Yeah.
That Seattle looks past San Diego because they doubled San Diego up in their home opener. They won 28-14 and looked about as good as you can look in a game. And San Diego looked about as bad as you can look in a game. I mean, it looked after that first game like Seattle was just going to, take off in a rocket ship, and like San Diego might as well just like pack their bags and just get ready for a short season because they were going to be nowhere near the playoffs. And since then, we've just seen San Diego get better and better. I do think it's very notable that KJ Koo's out of this game because in his first game, he looked great for them. And I think he would have been a very important piece in this game. But I think if Seattle looks too hard at that first game of the season and thinks that they're going to have the same success, I think they could really find themselves in trouble. Like you said, this is a long road trip for Seattle, like having to go to Southern California for a couple of games. San Diego playing at home. They've been playing really well. This is a game I could easily see Seattle dropping just because of the elevated play of the Growlers since that first loss of the season. What can go right for them? They've got the crew together. When they've had that Garrett Martin, Khalif El Salam, Zeppelin Ronig, like out on the field together with Lucas Ambrose there, like anchoring the defense. I mean, they are down a couple of players that I think could be very helpful for them and are definitely in their top 20. But like having those four players there, not to even mention some of the other guys who have been playing.
I'll throw in. I just have to throw in
Brown also.
Jack Brown is fantastic. I wanted to throw in the throwing additions of Christian Foster and Derek Murad. They've been absolute difference makers for their ability to stretch the field vertically for them on both offensive and defensive rotations, mostly on offense. But they just give an explosiveness that really activates what was already a pretty potent highlight producing core of, again, your aforementioned Zeppelin Ronigs, Khalif El Salam, Jack Brown, and Garrett Martins.
Well, and as you mentioned, stretching the field, they have the third highest huck completion percentage in the league at almost 70% on 41 hucks. I mean, they're as lethal of a hucking team as there is in the league. And like you mentioned, the additions of Christian Foster and Derek Murad, definitely helping with that. I think having that crew together and just knowing that they're going to be there for the weekend, that's where they've looked so good when they've all been on the field together. And having that reliability offensively, something that they haven't really had in seasons past, at least recent seasons past. I think that's something that they can lean on throughout both of these games. They have the ability to score and score quickly. And that just puts more pressure on the opposing O-line. I felt, as somebody who has played more games and more points than anyone in this league, I can tell you that there is a pressure that mounts on your offense when you see the opposing offense go out there and score in 30 seconds or less. And we've been in games like that where we score and we put together a nice drive and, we go get water, and it almost seems by the time we've gotten a drink and gotten a quick note from coach, we're back on the field because the other team scored so quickly. And that can really wear on you, not only mentally as you're thinking, oh my gosh, they're just scoring so fast, but physically it can wear on you. You're not getting the very long breaks, and it might not seem like that big a deal, but when in those higher scoring games, which Seattle's had a few this year already, when they're able to score as quickly as they are and make you just continually go out there in short rest, it adds up. It takes a toll on you. So that's what can go right, is that they do just have this efficient offense that's scoring very quickly, and they're putting a lot of pressure on both San Diego and LA to keep up.
On the flip side, if San Diego gets a win, they'll be in a virtual tie with Seattle in the division. I mean, I don't think that they beat the Cascades by 14 goals and overcome the head-to-head tiebreaker that Seattle established in week 1, but what we've been talking about this Growlers team, they're coming on. They're going to make themselves an opportunity at some point for how hard they're playing and how closely they're contesting these top teams in the division. And I don't know if this comes against Seattle this weekend or further down the road. But again, Travis Dunn right now is top 8 in both scoring and receiving yards. He's just a problem out there on the field that you have to account for, and everything else is kind of skewing out from there. You know, like Max Gibson has stepped up a level in his second season. He's already been one of the most productive offensive players in the division coming off of a fantastic rookie year in 2023. And now he seems to be limiting more and more the turnovers that were a little bit of the issue around him. So he's just becoming a big target downfield for them to engage their fast break. They've got veterans all over the roster that just know how to play. The Growlers are going to be a tough out. And then again, in LA on Sunday, this is not a Seattle team that we are used to seeing close out winnable games. And it's just going to be a real, I feel like, litmus test for the Cascades playoff hopes as to whether they can at least split these games, if not avoid going 0-2, because 0-2 would mean falling basically behind both LA and San Diego in the standings, as well as dropping behind an Oakland team that they're in a virtual tie with.
Yeah, I mean, the West is a mess. Like it's kind of like
in the best way.
In the best way, yeah. Like just trying to figure out. I mean, it's like that meme of what Zach Galifianakis and all the numbers are just like coming across and all the variables. I also want to give a shout out to the coaching staff of like the Growlers. I think they've been like, we don't talk. I harp a lot. I've harped a lot on Swing Pass so far about some of the terrible jobs I think some coaches have been doing with like not utilizing timeouts and things like that. But credit where credit's due to Kevin Stewart, Kayla Helton, and I guess we can say Goose Helton as well.
Goose Helton too, man.
Yeah. If you haven't seen it, there was an article by the Sporting News, detailing some of the things that Goose has gone through in his recovery process from his motorcycle accident about 18 months ago, I think at this point. If you haven't read it, I believe UFA retweeted it. It's definitely worth a read. And honestly, like, as someone who's been texting back and forth with Goose a little bit through this process, like, doesn't even really touch on everything he's had to go through, but as the players said, and you know, some of the players mentioned in there, like, he was always kind of like a coach on the field when he was playing, and now he is obviously not playing as he continues to like work back from the injuries he sustained in the accident. And you know, it seems like, you know, what a power couple, him Goose and Kayla Helton over there helping coach up that team. And that's a lot of ultimate knowledge, ultimate experience, you know, between those two, between Coach Kevin, also adding Coach Kevin Stewart. Like, it seems like there's been a real difference that's been made with like just the way they've approached their matchups since their struggles early in the season. And I don't think that happens without some good coaching. Like, you know, teams don't typically just get better on their own. Something has to change. And that, you know, you pair that with having Travis Dunn, that always helps. But yeah, I mean, they've really had a big turnaround since the beginning of the season. And I mentioned, like, they have 6 games remaining in their schedule against essentially the 3 teams you expect to be competing for that last playoff spot. You could almost even say Colorado, as we mentioned with their tough schedule earlier, who also might just be competing for a playoff spot at this point. It's up for grabs for them. I mean, it's there for them to take, but we'll see what Seattle can muster up this weekend, because Seattle also could put themselves completely in the driver's seat if they have a 2-0 weekend.
Yeah, I mean, Seattle, I feel like, is the biggest mercurial team heading into week 6, where it's just like they could improve their stock the most. They could be 5-2 if they do sweep their SoCal road trip, or they could be 3-4 looking up at potentially 5 teams above them in the West Division standings. So real hit or miss. And I just wanted to take a second to touch on the Goose stuff because it's been something that I've been a little remiss about mentioning on this podcast because it's been such a developing story. But, Goose Helton, 2-time league MVP, an absolute founder of this league and this sport more generally, right? Like, I mean, you talk about him being an on-the-field coach, as the Sporting News article mentions, for the Growlers. I mean, this is Mr. Cut Camp. This is a guy that, like you, who has just been at the forefront of being an ambassador for this league and the sport for the better part of a decade. And he had one of the more horrific motorcycle accidents that I've heard of, had dozens of surgeries to prevent losing his left leg entirely. I believe it was his left leg. He's now back doing workouts that I think would, quite frankly, shame a lot of otherwise well-meaning athletes and things, with basically almost like a working prosthetic with what he's working back with. He didn't end up having to lose his leg. It's one of the big pieces of that Sporting News story that he basically had to fight off an amputation. I don't even have words to describe the kind of perseverance and commitment that guy has to both the sport, himself, the Growlers organization, and just, I think, a love for Ultimate, right? And a love for being active. And I just wanted to kind of give a quick shout out, like you did, to somebody who I think has been in the background and in a lot of our thoughts for quite some time. And it's been, I think, really difficult to talk about in a more general setting about what he's been working back from. But I feel like with where the Growlers are getting to right now, as far as just being like this well coached, again, disciplined team, it's indicative of them having Goose back more and more. Like, that is a reference point of his presence becoming more and more a part of this Growlers organization again, after they experienced such tragedy at the start of 2023. Again, we didn't really mention it much because I feel like it was such a earthquake through the Ultimasphere. Honestly, like, I don't know, you probably experienced some version of this when that news came down the pipeline. It was just, I mean, kind of earth shaking, man. I mean, he was the guy I think we all thought of as being the dude who is going to extend his playing career further out into the elite ultimate competitive sphere, further than anyone had ever previously thought possible. And then it was like him facing a possible amputation. I mean, it was an impossible scenario. And here he is coming back.
I'm going to try not to get emotional. I shared this with him via text, which is probably a good thing for me, because I'm sure if I said it to him on the phone or something, I would have been incoherent. But I owe a lot of who I am as a player, and even in some ways as a teammate and a person, to Goose. In 2012, he was an Alley Cat that first season. I tried really hard to get him to come back the next year, but he was commuting from Chicago, and Chicago started their team in 2013. And I was a complete nobody, if you want to know how much of a nobody I was, in our first game ever, we play in Columbus. I score 7 goals. And literally after, I don't know, the third or fourth one, some guy from Columbus goes, "Who the hell is this guy that keeps beating us deep?" They literally didn't know my name. Like, that's how they didn't even consider that I would be important at all. And they probably shouldn't have. I grew up so much in my understanding of the game, in my understanding of what it meant to really work hard. I mean, you talk about him extending his career and being a guy that we looked at as like, man, how long can this guy keep going? that's kind of how I am at this point, where I'm like, how long can I keep this going? And Goose is a big part of that. I saw what he was doing and thought, you know what, why can't I do that? Like, why can't I be like him and just keep extending and play at a high level for a long period of time? Goose is an amazing person. Like, he's not just an amazing old player. Anyone who's met him knows he's an even more amazing person than he is a player or an athlete. I'm incredibly fortunate to have been a teammate of his, even if it was just for one season. And I think he's one of those guys that, like, what I'm saying is not unique to me. I think probably anybody who's ever been a teammate of Goose Helton would echo what I'm saying right now. So, Goose, love you, man. I've looked up to you and modeled a lot of how I approach things based on how I know you approach things, and we're over here pulling for you. Like, we're continually in the Brock household talking about you, thinking about you, praying for you, and we're just really thankful that we know you. And you know, I have full faith that everything's going to work out, and you know, he's going to get to the point where it's going to look like the accident never happened. You know, I have full faith that this is all going to work out, because like you said, Goose had to fight just to keep his leg, and I know he's not going to stop fighting until he's gotten to where he needs to be. So
he's doing deadlifts and pool workouts again, man. Like, I don't want to get too far ahead, and I don't want to take much away from what you just said. So, unlike most of my sentiments on this show, I'm gonna keep it pretty short. But to your point, he's just one of those guys where he reopened the possibility of, I don't know what to expect from him anymore. In the same way that, like, I don't know if he could maybe get back onto the field. I don't want to put that as like a point, but like, given how tenacious he's been in his recovery process, and given how we all were sort of wondering how long he would just extend his playing career, I always felt like the number was 50. I felt like he was going to play Elite Ultimate until he was 50 plus years old. So like that kind of end. But I wanted to just sort of add to your point about Goose being the person that sort of builds you up. He was one of the first people that ever complimented me in any sort of role in this a job sphere and in the professional level. I did a very rinky-dink interview with him, very unprepared, over a decade ago now, and just kind of hemming and hawing and shooting the shit with him afterwards. He just said, "Oh, you really know your stuff." And at that point, I did not. I was a forum warrior, very much kind of piecing together my knowledge. And it just meant the world to me to hear somebody like him say something like that. And so I just very much fall into the same category as you, of being somebody who I think unwittingly to him was very motivated by something he said to me in passing. He's just, he's one of those dudes in this community, and I think that there's probably a few more hundred people like us, given just the kind of guy he is. But as I feel like as worthwhile and important as that was, and one of my favorite sort of segments that we've just sort of spun off into on the show, I do want to get to one more matchup in the week 6 slate. I know, again, just massive slate, but there is one more that bears mentioning, and that is the
Alley Cats Thunderbirds. Oh wait,
huh?
Is that not what you were gonna say?
What?
You weren't gonna say Alley Cats Thunderbirds? That wasn't what you were gonna say.
Well, maybe if Carl Johnson and Max Shepard weren't both doubtful for Pittsburgh, I would take that a little bit more as something to enshrine. And it will be a very important matchup for both Indianapolis and Pittsburgh. But
it will be.
The game I wanted to get to and to ask you about, as far as what could go right and what could go wrong, is DC and Boston. DC sitting at 3-1. Boston right now 3-2, but having faced New York on Friday. Again, getting a Saturday intermission before facing the number 2 team in the East in the Breeze. Breeze will also be activating Jasper Tom and Jacques Nissen, the latter of whom is coming off of a collegiate national championship title this past Monday. Jasper Tom also making his 2024 debut, one of the most important handler defenders in the entire league. And again, against a Boston team that could be really surging and kind of at a new level than we've never seen before if they get a win against the Empire on Friday, or could be really fending off, falling into the kind of back half of that East Division where it's once again New York and DC sitting a level or two above the rest of the competition. So what could go right for Boston and what could go wrong? I know we kind of already asked this end of the question in their matchup against the Empire, but it also figures against this Breeze team who Boston has never won against.
What can go right for Boston is that they find success in the deep game. With Orion Cable, Tyler Chan, and Jeff Babbitt, that is a pretty lethal group that can really take advantage of you deep. Tyler Chan with his speed, Babbitt and Orion Cable with both their speed and their
Tanner
size.
Tanner Johnson go too.
Tanner Johnson did. I mean, that just kind of shows you, right? I had to wait until he had to be the fourth person I was going to mention.
Yeah.
And the Breeze are the second worst team in the league against the Huck. I mean, they're giving up 71% completion percentage. We saw Philadelphia go 9 for 10 on Hucks against them in their last matchup, where James Pollard was just kind of otherworldly. And we haven't really seen this Boston attack, despite having some pieces that we think can be so good in the deep space, really be able to find a way to take advantage of that. If they can find a way to get that deep game going, that's going to be the success point for them. We saw in their last matchup, while there was a little bit of weather, it really just seemed like both teams couldn't find their footing for other reasons. It was a lot of small ball, a lot of swing, not really, gain 5 yards, lose 10 yards. If they can find some success and find some opportunities to shoot it deep, I think that's where Boston can really kind of find their advantage in this game. On the flip side, it's almost, I'm literally almost going the opposite. DC has started to find their footing after a few seasons of not really being able to shoot it deep. They've started to find their footing in their deep game. I think kind of this new look offense for them, where they've got Bonet and sometimes occasionally Thomas Edmonds over there, and Cole Jurek being over there occasionally. It seems like they're starting to find some success in the deep game that they kind of lacked over the last few seasons, and even that they lacked early on this year. And we've seen this Boston defense be pretty stout, but where they've really been effective is in kind of limiting the upfield motion and doing what we talked about Carolina doing, where it feels like they're disconnecting the backfield from like the deeper space and not really allowing them to get there. DC has offensively looked really great, as we expect them to every year, because they've been really great on offense for several seasons now. But now with this added element where their deep game is starting to take off, that makes them so dangerous, because they're no longer the team that just has to rely on short pass. They can go short pass and then beat you deep, which is something we would not have said about them in the previous few seasons. So I think for both teams, it's really going to come down to who's more successful in the deep game, and that's basically going to tell us who wins.
Yeah, and I also feel like DC currently has the two best players in this matchup, and all due respect to the reigning MVP, Jeff Babbitt, Cole Jurek and Thomas Edmonds really have been on that level for DC this year. I mean, Edmonds wasn't active in their win against Philadelphia in double overtime, but Jurek was arguably their best player. I mean, I know Tyler Monroe and Elliot Bonet had fantastic games. Andrew Roy has been amazing for them in the backfield, barely making a mistake this year. Again, they added Nissen, but Jurek has been that guy. He's playing both ways for them. He's just able to get the disc at times and make statement plays when they need it the most. And Edmonds has been the same way. Last year, he was emphatic against Boston. He didn't commit a turnover in 3 games. He had a couple of his biggest plays in their win at Boston, and he just figures to be a dude who will be looking to take advantage of some of the Boston players playing their second game of the weekend. I don't know, like it feels like one of those weekends that Boston might have been able to handle at a different point, but given where they're at right now, this could really set them back.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned it earlier, but both of these matchups are just so incredibly important for them because it is the second of 2 meetings for both of them, and they are down 0-1 in both series. The good news for them is both those games were close, so even just winning the New York game by 3 gets them the advantage. If they win the DC game by more than a goal, they have the head-to-head advantage on them. So there is that element of it, but yeah, they could come out of this weekend 0-2 and essentially already be relegated to at best the third seed in the playoffs. And that isn't where this Boston team wants to be. That's where they were last year. And after adding several pieces, including, Ben Katz and Jeff Babbitt, and being able to get 2 players of that caliber added to your roster, you would want to take that next step. You would want to take that leap forward. So losing both of these games could put them in a situation where they really can't leap forward unless they find a way to win a playoff game, which is going to have to be on the road at that point.
I just feel like we spent like the past hour and a half talking about how all of these teams can't afford to drop either of the games that they have setting up. Again, there's going to be 14 games. 10 of the teams will be faced with double headers. And so it's just, we talked about at the end of the last episode, it could either be one of those weekends where everything becomes very clear and there's a lot of clarity, or we could get one of the most messy and brawl-heavy results after this Week 6 slate. I mean, it could go either way. And given the way that this season has gone so far, I'm trending towards the latter. I just feel like we're going to get like Boston over New York on Friday, and then they lose to DC, and we don't know what's going on there. Carolina loses to Austin somehow. Atlanta loses to Carolina and drops to 2-3. So then they're behind Houston. You and I talked about in the pregame where Atlanta would have 3 losses, but their only 2 wins would come to out of divisional opponents. So they would be behind the Havoc in the South Division standings. Anyways, it could be an absolute melee. It could be total pandemonium. We'll be tuning in with you all weekend long. Again, there's 14 games going on. You can find the Super Series battle between Atlanta and Colorado live and free on the UFA YouTube channel. The other 13 matchups, as well as that one, will be available on watchufa.tv live. But that will do it for this preview pod heading into Week 6 from Cam and I. We will be back with you in just a couple of days to recap all of this glorious action and hopefully have a better idea of what we're looking at as far as a playoff picture at this midway point, well, almost midway point of the 2024 regular season. Again, that will do us here and now. We'll talk to you soon. Bye now.
The UFA Super Series delivers another marquee matchup as the Atlanta Hustle and Colorado Summit meet in the mountains for the next chapter in Free Friday Frisbee. The Hustle, already with a statement win over New York, now seeks to silence all the energetic Summit fans out west. Join us Friday, May 31st as Atlanta collides with Colorado in the UFA Super Series.